For the last 7 months, Julian Assange has been stuck in the embassy incommunicado. They've shut off all communications. Not just shut off all communications, to put it in perspective, they went so far as to have 3 signal jammers installed to the embassy to block phone and Wi-Fi signals. All visitors other than legal visits were refused by the embassy, including meetings requested by the major human rights organization and members of parliament. And for months, Mr. Assange's lawyer requested that the government provide administrative or a legal basis for the restrictive measures in order to challenge the legality before the courts. The government refused to provide information that would allow him to challenge the measures before the court. So that's what's been taking place for the last 7 months. They issued a quote-unquote special protocol. Part of the special protocol, the media reported, was meant to humiliate Julian Assange, saying stuff he needed to clean his room as if he was a child and he needed to take better care of his cat. He's an adult. He's a grown man. A lot of this had to do with the fact of a relationship between the United States and Ecuador and the UK, where those governments were putting pressure on the Ecuadorian government essentially to make the Ecuadorian government hand over Assange. Part of that, Ecuador recently secured $1.1 billion in loans. The U.S. representative to the IMF told Ecuador in the late... In fact, I'll let you see what I'm reading, as opposed to me just reading it. The protocol appears in the context of a strong supportive ruling by the right here. Ecuador recently secured 1.1 billion in loans. U.S. representative to the IMF told Ecuador in late 2017 that the loans were conditional on Ecuador resolving the Assange and Chevron matters. Throughout the summer, pressure from the United States lawmakers mounted on Ecuador to hand Assange over to the UK. In June, President Moreno met with Vice President Mike Pence. Moreno denied Assange had been discussed. The White House, on the other hand, stated, Vice President met with Ecuador leader, the White House official tells Pool. The VP raised the issue of Mr. Assange. It was constructive conversation. They agreed to remain in close coordination on the potential next steps going forward. Now, there are reports from the Hill where they were talking about death for WikiLeaks and all this other stuff that the Trump administration now, of course, don't like this idea of WikiLeaks because you can imagine that the Trump administration, the last thing they want is information revealed on the corruption and cronyism associated with their rapacious, repugnant governance. Assange challenged this quote-unquote protocol in the Ecuadorian court. Now, I did the case recently where I went through what took place in the last trial. Eventually, I think it was on the 28th, they said that they didn't understand Australian English. It was very bizarre. Julian Assange was not as happy with the level of the translation, and the person who was dealing with the case said that they didn't understand an Australian brand of English, that the Australian dialect made it difficult to hear. Now, to be fair, I've heard people tell me that the American dialect is a little bit easier for people to hear as opposed to, let's say, the British, like the Queen's English. So fair enough. But anybody that's heard Julian Assange talk, his accent is not that over the top. But whatever. They couldn't understand the Australian dialect, and the case had to be postponed. Well, the case was postponed for a few days later, and I'm going to give you the results of that. So this is justice for Assange. The judge refused to rule on the constitutionality of the government's actions against Assange. Now, the reason that Assange took Ecuador to court is because Julian Assange made the argument that the special protocol, this idea of being able to the asylum being contingent on shutting him up, went against Ecuador's own law and this idea of his own right for self-determination. And went against this idea of asylum in Ecuador. He was challenging this idea of a special protocol, that his asylum was contingent upon him shutting up. NBC News covered this as if he cared. He took him to court over having to do with this cat in this room. It was nonsense. They were just sparing him. So let's go with the thing. So the judge refused to rule on the constitutionality of the government's action against Mr. Assange and said it was a matter for the Constitutional Court. I'm sorry, it's a long day. The judge declined to hear witnesses and declined to accept evidence documenting the embassy's visitor ban. On October 30th, 2018, the case was appealed to the provincial court. Now, Ecuador, the government that's in charge, the government that does not want Julian Assange at all and want to get Julian Assange out of that embassy and find any reason at all to hand him over. And even further, do I have this up? I don't have it up. All right. And even further, Ecuador is threatening him based on what was supposed to be legal testimony, meaning the judge allowed him to talk. They released the ban because the judge wanted Assange to give his own testimony in court. Now, after that, they released this. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs welcomed the decision on October 29th by Judge Karina Martinez, dismissing the lawsuit filed by Mr. Assange's lawyers, or the lawyers of Mr. Assange, who has been living in asylum in the Embassy of Ecuador in London for over 6 years. The judge's decision ratified that the protocol, which regulates the visits, communications, medical care of Mr. Assange, is in harmony with human rights, is fully consistent with the rights of asylum and national law, and emanates from the sovereign power of the state of Ecuador to grant or revoke asylum and to make decisions regarding measures that guarantee both the rights of Mr. Assange as well as the compliance by him of his obligations as an asylee. I don't think that's what it did. The judge declined to hear witnesses. The judge refused to rule on the constitutionality of the government's actions against Mr. Assange and said it was a matter for the Constitutional Court. Here's the link. I don't know what they're talking about. I have no idea what they're talking about. The protocol reestablishes that Mr. Assange access to communications, but he is warned that, as an asylee and pursuant to the international treaties that govern asylum, he may not make statements, transmissions, or announcements that interfere with the state or may affect the interests of Ecuador. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs reiterates to the public the steadfast adherence of the state of Ecuador to the relevant rules of national and international law and govern asylum. The Foreign Ministry of Ecuador will enforce these rules to defend national interests in accordance with due process. Likewise, Ecuador will require that the asylee respect the sovereignty and the good name of the country and will not allow unwarranted, untrue assertions or insinuations that the conduct of the national government concerning the diplomatic asylum that was granted to Mr. Assange in exercise of the prerogative of the powers of the state of Ecuador. Are you saying that he can't challenge you in court if he believes that what you're doing is inappropriate to him? This sounds like he's threatening Assange for what he said in court. This one is not meant to be long. This one is just meant to be an update. Happy Halloween indeed. Yusuf David, did Ecuador know I wasn't here? Okay, happy Halloween. Happy Halloween back at you. I just broke up with my girlfriend. Oh, I'm sorry, dude. That sucks. I'm sorry. Really signal jammers. Yes, really signal jammers. Cryptic warrior. My neighbor 2-year-old grandson died today after a boyfriend abused him. I'm sorry to hear that. The prerogative of Ecuador is to break their own laws in this case. Well, the wild part about it is this is more to do with the government that coming into play, creating a relationship with the United States. The president has said that Julian Assange is a thorn in his shoe. And right here, Ecuador secured $1.1 billion in loans. The U.S. representative to the IMF told Ecuador in late 2017 that the loans were conditional on Ecuador resolving the Assange and Chevron matters. You want this money? Fix the Assange thing. And by fix it, we mean hand him over to the UK so they can extradite him to the United States. That's what it is. That's what it is. That's my suspicion wherever. The U.S. government is a thorn in his shoe. Well, they want a relationship with the U.S. government, and in getting that relationship with the U.S. government, they're willing to hand Julian Assange over. Assange is to some degree a pawn. The catch is there are laws that they're bound by, that they're stuck with. That's why he says they're a thorn in their shoe. Right here, this is what's taking place today, apparently. I don't know if it's still going on. Protests in front of Ecuador's presidential palace heats up as U.S.-linked political party moves to strip Julian Assange of citizenship to facilitate extradition. Article 79 of Ecuador's constitution banned extradition of citizens. The thing is, if you remember, Julian Assange is now a citizen of Ecuador. And so they can't just get rid of him without completely ignoring their own laws. There's a faction of Ecuador that is aligned with the United States that are trying to remove that article, allowing an easier transition of Julian Assange. They're willing to torch their own constitution and their own citizenship to some degree, or their own rights, in order to please the United States. That's a fail. That's an utter betrayal, if you're being honest. That is an utter and complete betrayal. But why would they wait this long to shut him up and make him move on? Well, the reason this had to do with the president that coming into office. The new president that came into office was more subservient to the United States interests, far more so than the previous president. The last president that transitioned, not Moreno, Correa, I think that's right. He was more into this idea of Ecuadorian sovereignty. He bristled at this idea of the United States having influence over the affairs of Ecuador in this way. The new president, not so much. The old president didn't realize that the new president was this way. And not just that, they tried to put charges on the new president. On the old president. They tried to put charges on the old president. So, I'll leave this here. United States took down the old president's plane. Was that Ecuador? I didn't think it was Ecuador. I thought that was Honduras. But I could be wrong. I don't fully remember. But I know what you're talking about. They pulled the plane down thinking that Julian Assange was on that plane. Yeah. Yeah. I remember this. Not Assange. Was it Snowden? They thought Snowden was on the plane. I thought it was Honduras. I thought they was looking for Edward Snowden. But I could be wrong. I don't fully remember the details, but I think I know what you're talking about. It was Snowden, yeah. Yeah. It was Snowden. All right. I will end this here. Bad news for Assange. Let's be honest. It's bad news. It would have been nice if the court ruled on this. It would have been nice if it ruled in favor of Assange. But they kicked the ball down the field, apparently to the Constitutional Court. We'll see if Assange brings the court up to the Constitutional Court. One thing I want to note, though, this notion that the government is putting out that the judge's ruling was an affirmation, like, this is nonsense. The decision by Katrina dismissing the lawsuit filed by the lawyers of Mr. Assange, who's been living in asylum over the last, this says ratified that the protocol which regulates the visits, communications, and medical care of Assange is in harmony with humor. It didn't do any of that. It didn't do any of that at all. It kicked it to the Constitutional Court, saying they didn't have the jurisdiction to rule. There's a difference in those things. But nevertheless, they're claiming a win. So I'll leave it here. All right, guys. You all have a good one. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support the Patreon. Sad day. Thanks all.